I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit today about how I think about missile defense and where I think we're headed and what we're up to. But before talking, or actually launching, if you'll pardon the pun, specifically into missile defense, I'd like to begin by setting a little bit of a strategic baseline. As you'll see, it will impact what I say about missile defense. Since everything that we do should be, in one way or another, derived strategically, Chairman Dempsey and I tend to look at strategy as linking and balancing ends, ways, and means, and then taking a look at the resultant risk. Ultimately, we believe that at the end of the day, the ends of our strategy, and this is reflected in the QDR, are fundamentally about protecting our national security interests, and that we ought to clearly understand what those interests are, and that some are more important than others. Not only does this enable us to offer advice on when and how to use force, it means we can link those interests to our advice on how to allocate the ever-decreasing means that were being provided by Congress. And in between the ends and the means lies the fertile ground of ways and how we go about getting it all done. The more creative and resourceful we can be in crafting those ways, and the tougher we are on ourselves and how we manage our own resources, the better we can preserve our ends with fewer means. One of our most important ways is deterrence, which really comes in two forms. One is showing an adversary we can deny his objectives, in other words, his attack will fail, and alternatively, that we can and will impose unacceptable costs on that adversary if he's foolish enough to actually attack. Every bit of what I just said applies to missile defense. If we consider that at the top of our list of national security interests is probably the survival of our nation, then at the top of the list of threats to that interest is obviously a massive nuclear attack from Russia. Because we prefer to use the deny objectives tool of missile defense in situations where it has the highest probability of being successful and being most productive, as you know, we've told Russia and the world that we will not rely on missile defense for strategic deterrence of Russia, because it would simply be too hard and too expensive and too strategically destabilizing to even try. Even though Russians have a hard time believing us on this, it has the very great virtue of actually being true. Rather, we rely for deterrence of Russia on our ability to respond massively to an attack, and that, as we know, has worked for a very long time. But we do have other interests around the globe, where what we call limited missile defense quickly comes sharply into focus as being very relevant, beginning with our determination to prevent catastrophic attacks on our nation. This is about ensuring we can deny the objectives of any insecure authoritarian state that believes acquisition of deliverable weapons of mass destruction is key to the preservation of its regime. The number of states trying to achieve that capability is growing, not shrinking, with our principal current concern, of course, being North Korea, because they're closest in terms of capability, followed by Iran. And because we're not betting on Dennis Rodman as our current deterrent against future North Korean ICBM threat, we believe a robust and capable missile defense is our best bet to defend the United States from such an attack. And it is, in my view, our #1 missile defense priority, which is why the systems that provide this defense, such as our Ground-Based Interceptor Program, or GBI, are accorded much higher priority than other items in our shrinking missile defense budget. But we do have other global national security interests, including strong support for our allies and partners around the world, as well as protecting American citizens around the world, including our own troops, wherever they may be present out there in the world. Thus, we also place a good bit of emphasis on regional missile defense, closely cooperating with a number of key partners in this area. But in a world of declining budgets, it's likely we'll come to rely more on those partners to resource the means for their defense as we work more closely together on the ways. And we're doing just that. So let me spend a little bit more time talking a bit about each of these two interest-based missile defense priorities: defense of the homeland and regional ballistic missile defense. Regarding the homeland, The fact of the matter is that Iranian and North Korean space launch and other activities include multi-stage systems that can feed development of ballistic missile technology for longer-range systems, including ICBMs. We have to take that threat seriously, even though neither nation yet has a mature capability, and both nations know they would face an overwhelming U.S. response to any attack. While we would still obviously prefer to take a threat missile out while it's still on the ground, left of launch, we won't always have the luxury of doing so. And because it's our policy to stay ahead of the threat, we don't want there to be any doubt about our commitment to having a solid right of launch capability. So the latter, right of launch capability piece, boils down to how many missiles we can knock down versus how many the threat can launch. It's that simple. And that is much more than just a function of how many interceptors we have in silos in the ground. It's also a function of how good those interceptors are in terms of capability and reliability. Now, we in the military often say quantity has a quality all its own. Well, in the missile defense world, quality has a quantity all its own. If, for example, because of system improvements, we only have to shoot half the number of interceptors per incoming warhead than we used to, then we can handle twice the number of inbound warheads. That's why we're taking so much time and effort to improve the capability and reliability of our GBI system. In the wake of the last Capability Enhancement 2 shot, or CE2 shot, we took against a target several years ago, which flew perfectly until I watched it personally fail in the last 2 seconds, the Missile Defense Agency has done a terrific job diagnosing what happened. As Ellen mentioned, I'm a former F-14 pilot, and as one of those people flying those very old airplanes, I know that when something's not working, you wring out the entire system. You don't stop at the first thing you find wrong, and you don't stop at the first possible fix to anything you find wrong. And MDA has done exactly that. They've taken their time, and they've done it right. Last year, they launched an improved CE2 interceptor, not against an actual target because that wasn't the point of the test, but simply to put it through its paces to ensure that they had actually solved the problem that they had found. And it performed magnificently. Our next shot, this time against a target, is coming very soon, and we're doing everything we can to ensure it's a success. If it is a success, candidly, it will be a very good shot in the arm for this program. And we will resume production on 14 more in-progress missiles in keeping with our fly-before-buy philosophy. We fully intend to put those interceptors into the ground by the end of 2017 in order to increase our capacity to stay ahead of the threat. As we announced last year, with the extra 14 GBIs, we will have 44 interceptors in Alaska and Vandenberg Air Force Base. We also, as you may know, have an ongoing program in work to improve the actual kill vehicle that rides on top of that interceptor. But again, the quality has a quantity all its own dimension is not just about our interceptors. I would put my next nickel in sensors, because having enough and good enough sensors that can detect and discriminate a threat coming over the horizon can save a lot of waste in terms of how many interceptors we send up to knock one down. We have a lot going on in this area. Thanks to our Japanese partners, we're deploying an additional TPY-2 radar to that nation by the end of this year to both improve our homeland and regional defense capabilities at the same time. We're also continuing to operate the SBX radar afloat as needed in the Pacific to provide discrimination capabilities to protect CONUS and Hawaii. And pending congressional support of the FY15 President's budget requests, we're planning to deploy a new long-range discriminating radar in the Pacific region by the 2020 timeframe. Additionally, we're continuing to pursue greater use of space, UAS-based technologies, and increased integration of existing sensor capabilities across the command and control battle management system to significantly enhance our missile defense discrimination capabilities in the future. Now, while your sessions today are primarily about ballistic missile defense, I don't want to overlook cruise missile defense, particularly as it regards the homeland. You might ask, if we choose to not invest the enormous resources that would be required to defend against a massive Russian ICBM attack coming over the North Pole, then why on earth would we care about missile defense, cruise missile defense in the homeland? Well, the element of surprise is nearly impossible with an ICBM attack, and thus we will have time to react. We can't always say the same for a cruise missile attack. So we're also devoting a good bit of attention to ensuring we're properly configured against such an attack on the homeland, and we need to continue to do so. Now, turning to regional missile defense, there's been a massive proliferation, as you know, in recent years of regional ballistic missile threats, including an increase of more than 1,200 missiles over the last 5 years. There are now almost 6,000 known ballistic missiles in the world, and that's not counting Russia and China. Within this proliferation, we see a number of technical advancements, including advanced liquid and solid propellant propulsion technologies, and missiles that are becoming more reliable, mobile, accurate, and capable of striking targets over longer distances. Some can target ships at sea. Many have shorter launch preparation times and smaller footprints that are making them more survivable. Technical and operational measures to defeat missile defenses are also increasing. For example, several nations exercise near simultaneous salvo firings of short and medium-range ballistic missiles from multiple locations to saturate regional missile defenses. Against all this, not only have we brought our own missile defense capability to bear, in which we've deployed some kind of missile defense system in 10 different countries, and we have 30 Aegis ships capable of doing the missile defense mission, a number of which are on station at any given moment. We're also encouraging our allies and partners to acquire their own missile defenses and to strengthen missile defense cooperation that will result in better performance than individual countries acting alone. For example, in the Middle East, the United States is working with a number of our Gulf Cooperation Council partners on missile defense, including supporting purchases through foreign military sales. The UAE is procuring THAAD, with the first delivery expected next year. This in addition to its earlier purchase of Patriot systems. And Saudi Arabia is in process of upgrading its existing Patriot PAC-2 batteries to the PAC-3 configuration. And Kuwait is also purchasing PAC-3 batteries. The United States also maintains a strong missile defense relationship with Israel, and our cooperation on missile defense has resulted in a comprehensive missile defense architecture with that nation. Israeli programs which the U.S. has supported, such as Iron Dome, the David Sling weapon system, and the Arrow weapon system, in conjunction with operational cooperation, create a multi-layered architecture designed to protect the Israeli people from varying types of missile defense or missile threats. In the Asia-Pacific, we have a strong missile defense posture in the region for both homeland and regional missile defense. The cornerstone of our security and diplomacy has been our strong bilateral alliances with South Korea, Japan, and Australia. Going forward, we will continue to emphasize the importance of developing regional ballistic missile defense systems. We know this is a very politically sensitive topic for several of our regional allies, but progress in this area would only increase our confidence in the face of persistent North Korean provocations. During last year's provocation cycle, it appeared that North Korea might conduct a test of a regional capable ballistic missile that could potentially reach U.S. soil in Guam. In response, as many of you are aware, the U.S. Army did a magnificent job of rapidly deploying a THAAD battery to that island. There it remains, readily deployable if necessary to somewhere else in the world, but in the meantime, defending U.S. soil from potential threats. And with the unpredictability of the North Korean regime, we may find ourselves doing more of this sort of thing in the future elsewhere in the region. And in Europe, our commitment to NATO missile defense remains ironclad, as Secretary Hagel has said, as demonstrated by our strong support for missile defense capabilities either already deployed or being developed for the European phased adaptive approach, our contribution to NATO missile defense. Here I'd like to lay to rest a persistent misconception that in shifting away from the original program to place 10 two-stage GBIs in Europe, that somehow the United States walked away from European ballistic missile defense. That's just not true, and it's not does not do justice to the great efforts of my predecessor, General Cartwright. He realized that the ICBM threat from Iran was progressing more slowly, and the medium and intermediate range threat more rapidly than we had anticipated. It made great sense at the time, and still does, to shift to the European phased adaptive approach that's based on the SM-3 missile, Exhibit A to my left, and away from the GBI. And that's what we're doing. Rather than only 10 missiles that will have limited IRBM or MRBM capability, we will eventually have 48 missiles on the ground in Europe that can very capably counter the real regional threat. This approach brought SM-3 interceptors into the European theater in 2011 aboard deployed ships. We've broken ground on the first EPAA site in Romania, and it will be operational in December of 2015. Just 1 week ago, we had a very successful test shot in Hawaii that demonstrated the functionality of the shore-based Aegis weapon system by verifying its ability to launch, control, establish uplink and downlink communications, provide guidance command, and provide target information to a standard Missile 3 Block 1B guided missile. As of this year, the first of 4 BMD-capable ships to be stationed at Rota in Spain, USS Donald Cook, has already deployed to Europe, and the USS Ross will arrive this summer. The final 2 ships, USS Carney and USS Porter, will arrive in 2015. We are committed, and this program is on track, and our NATO allies are also making significant contributions to the European Missile Defense Mission through their purchase and deployment of BMD-capable systems and deployment in support of NATO missions. And let me be clear once again. It's not the policy of the United States to build a ballistic missile defense system to counter Russian ballistic missiles. The Aegis ashore sites in Poland and Romania are designed to counter long-range ballistic missiles that may be launched from other nations outside of the Euro-Atlantic area against our European NATO partners. This system is designed to defeat a launch out of the Middle East from the south and not a launch from Russia in the east. EPAA sites are not designed for and can't counter Russian ICBMs or regional ballistic missiles because Russia deploys too many missiles, which are too sophisticated for this system to handle. Our sensors are not pointed in the right direction, and the interceptors we intend to deploy at these Aegis ashore sites will simply not have the velocity required to intercept Russian ICBMs. So let's lay that to rest. The most helpful thing that Russia, and China for that matter, can do is to persuade North Korea and Iran to drop their ballistic missile programs. We don't see that happening anytime soon, unfortunately. While we're on the topic of regional missile defense, though, I'd like to make the point that we need to keep our eyes closely on the cost curves. The simple fact is that a THAAD, which costs us around $11 million, could find itself being launched against a Scud missile that's proliferating rapidly that only costs $3 million. This curve is working against us, but there are 3 things we can do about it. First, we can keep the pressure on how much our own interceptors cost. It would be helpful in this regard to be able to buy them in economic quantities, but this is proving very hard to do under increased budget pressures. Second, we can continue our emphasis on developing the technologies required to hit ballistic missiles and their launchers left of launch. And finally, there's no shame in passive defense, such as denial, deception, mobility, and hardening. Our potential adversaries are doing these things, and there's no reason why we can't as well. Finally, I'd like to address several other misconceptions that are out there regarding ballistic missile defense. First, and most obvious, is the claim that our missile defense systems don't work, that we can't hit to kill. Well, we have an excellent track record with regional systems comprised of operationally configured THAAD interceptors and SM-3s. And as I mentioned, we're working very hard through our GBI issues, and we expect to raise the probability of intercept of those missiles soon. But basically, our test record using hit to kill has put this misconception to rest. To date, for our operationally configured interceptors, not development prototypes, mind you, THAAD is 11 for 11. Aegis BMD is 18 for 21. GMD is 3 for 6. And Patriot PAC-3 is 21 for 25. That's not bad, but we're determined to make it even better. The second misconception is that it's easy for an adversary to employ ballistic missile defense countermeasures. To be sure, we will continue to do everything we can in order to improve our own discrimination capability. But as hard as that job is, so is the challenge of employing and deploying countermeasures. If the enemy is confronting a layered defense system, whatever countermeasure work in mid-course might not work in terminal, and their terminal countermeasures may be destroyed in mid-course. Test is critical to the success of any complex weapon system, and when it comes to missile defense countermeasures, our adversaries just don't do much of it, which means they can't know very well how their countermeasures perform. We've had our own countermeasures program, an extensive one, and we've learned just how difficult it is to get that right. And countermeasures take up payload space and have weight considerations, which are also a trade-off. Bottom line is, countermeasures are not as easy as they look on paper. And last is the narrative that missile defense needs to be 100% effective to be successful, especially when nuclear weapons are involved. That's a simplistic argument. No system can achieve perfection. It would be hubris for us to believe otherwise. So if deterrence does fail, we don't necessarily expect to stop every single missile, though to be sure, we will try. Rather, the effective systems we have and are further developing are intended to deter an adversary by injecting considerable doubt into his mind regarding the effectiveness of his attack versus our likely response. The enemy knows there will be a significant price to pay with a missile launch against the United States. And the worst of all worlds for that enemy is that his attack is not only not effective, but it evokes a nasty response from us. Again, the two pillars of deterrence. So I believe our missile defense enterprise, if you'll pardon the quip, is on an upward trajectory. It's very healthy at the regional level, though it's on a tough cost curve, and it's coming back into health for defense of the homeland. I give great credit for all of this to Vice Admiral Jim Searing and his able staff and his predecessors. Shooting a bullet with a bullet is not an easy technical problem to solve. It's probably easier to kill Godzilla. Or maybe even, well, never mind. Shooting a bullet with a bullet, as I said, is pretty hard. It's even harder to do that when you're under time pressure. It's still harder when the assets are expensive and difficult to test. And it's even harder in a turbulent political environment and budget uncertainty. Yet we continue to make progress. We're making progress in our work with international partners. We're making progress in working with the warfighter to develop, test, and field a networked global ballistic missile defense system that's flexible, survivable, and affordable. And we're making progress in investing promising technology programs to ensure the missile defense program will be fully capable of defeating the complex threats we expect to see in the future. Now recall what I said earlier about the ways of strategy and how they can help preserve our ends when the means decline. Well, the good news is that many of the ways we do business in the missile defense area are very ripe for new innovation. Liddell Hart said, one of my favorite quotes, "The only thing that's harder than getting a new idea into the military mind is getting an old one out." Well, we're going to have to do a lot of work and work very hard to empower our people to do both of those things. And that's General Dempsey's and my greatest concern across the board, that we will not innovate quickly enough or deeply enough to be prepared for the world we will face over the next decade. Innovation is the leadership opportunity for this generation of missile defense practitioners and architects, which is why your session this afternoon on what's next promises to be so interesting. As we all know, the advantage in warfare shifts between offense and defense all the time. So where will railguns and directed energy and big data lead us within the missile defense realm? And what about the interesting strategic questions that will arise if and when technology actually does advance to the point where it's more possible and more economical to defend against ballistic missile attacks? In any case, one of our greatest advantages is our innovative spirit and the atmosphere we have in this country that permits it. This advantage will enable us to better protect the American people and to continue to stand by our close allies and friends around the world.